Sarah and Mark Thompson seemed like the quintessential perfect couple. They had been happily married for a decade and resided in an impressive Victorian-era house situated in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. Mark, a renowned architect, had built his reputation on his precise and innovative designs, coupled with an unwavering commitment to his work. His dedication to his craft had earned him accolades as one of the top professionals in his industry. Sarah, in stark contrast, was known for her vibrant personality and love for social gatherings. She thrived in lively environments, her presence lighting up any room she stepped into. Her warm and effervescent energy drew people toward her, making her the life of every party. However, behind the picturesque facade of their charming home, their marriage was struggling. Mark's relentless focus on his career left Sarah feeling increasingly isolated and unappreciated. The once fiery romance that had characterized their early years together had gradually faded. Over time, Sarah began to feel a deep void in her life, yearning for the love and excitement she once shared with her husband. She found herself reminiscing about the days when Mark would sweep her off her feet with grand romantic gestures like unexpected candlelit dinners or impromptu weekend getaways. Now those moments seemed like distant memories, and Sarah couldn't shake the longing for a spark that seemed to have been extinguished. Now their conversations revolved around Mark's work, the renovation of their home, and the mundane details of daily life. When Mark decided to hire two builders to handle the extensive renovations needed for their old Victorian house, Sarah saw it as an opportunity for something new. The two builders, Jack and Ryan, were everything Mark wasn't. Rugged, muscular, and exuding a raw masculine energy that Sarah found irresistible. Jack with his deep blue eyes and charming smile, and Ryan with his stark contrast to Mark's polished, refined nature. As the days passed, Sarah couldn't help but be drawn to the two men. Their physical presence and easygoing attitudes awakened a long-dormant desire within her. What began as harmless flirtation quickly grew into something much more dangerous. It wasn't long before Sarah's flirtations with Jack and Ryan became more brazen. She began spending more time at home during the renovations, offering the men drinks and snacks and engaging them in increasingly suggestive conversations. She reveled in the attention they gave her, the way they looked at her with open admiration, something she hadn't felt from Mark in years. One particularly hot afternoon, Sarah invited Jack and Ryan inside for a cold drink. Mark was away on a business trip, and the house was quiet except for the sounds of the builder's tools. The atmosphere was charged with unspoken tension as the three of them sat in the kitchen, the conversation flowing easily from work. To more personal topics, Jack was the first to make a move. As Sarah refilled his glass, he gently brushed his hand against hers, his touch lingering longer than necessary. She looked up to find him, gazing at her with a mischievous smile, and her heart skipped a beat. Ryan, sitting across the table, noticed the exchange but said nothing, a knowing look passing between him and Jack. Emboldened by the heat of the moment, Sarah leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a seductive whisper. "You boys have been working so hard. Maybe you deserve a little reward." The implication in her words was clear, and she could see the effect it had on both men. Jack and Ryan exchanged a glance, and without a word, they followed Sarah up the stairs to the master bedroom. The house, which had been filled with the noise of construction just moments ago, now seemed eerily silent. In the privacy of the bedroom, all three of them crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. What started as a single impulsive act quickly became a regular occurrence. Sarah was intoxicated by the thrill of the forbidden, the danger of getting caught, and the passion that had been missing from her life for so long. They threw caution to the wind, her secret trysts. But Sarah's carelessness would soon come back to haunt her. Mark returned from his business trip with a sense of unease that he couldn't quite shake. He had always been a man of intuition, able to read people and situations with remarkable accuracy, a skill that served him well in his career. But now, that same intuition was telling him that something was wrong at home. Sarah seemed different, more distant, more distracted. She would often leave the room to take calls, speaking in hushed tones, and she seemed to be spending more time at home than usual. At first, Mark tried to brush off his suspicions. He knew the renovation was stressful for Sarah, and he blamed her change in behavior on that. But the more he observed, the harder it became to ignore the signs. Small details began to stand out. The way Sarah would glance at her phone and smile, the sudden disappearances when the builders were around, the slight tension in her voice when Mark mentioned their names. Oh, one evening, while they were having dinner, Mark noticed that Sarah seemed particularly preoccupied. Her eyes kept darting to her phone, which she had placed face down on the table, a habit she had recently developed. When she excused herself to take a call, Mark couldn't resist the urge to check her phone. He knew it was a breach of trust, but his curiosity got the better of him. As soon as Sarah was out of earshot, Mark flipped the phone over and quickly scrolled through her recent messages. His heart pounded as he found several texts between Sarah and an unknown number, messages that were far too intimate to be from a friend. His stomach churned as he read them, the words confirming his worst fears. Sarah was having an affair. The realization hit Mark like a punch to the gut. His hands trembled as he put the phone back in its place, his mind racing with a mix of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. But instead of confronting Sarah immediately, he decided to wait. He needed more information, more evidence before he acted. Over the next few days, Mark kept a close eye on Sarah, gathering more proof of her infidelity. He noticed how she would send quick texts whenever she thought he wasn't looking, how her face would light up whenever she saw a new message. He even caught her sneaking out the house once, only to return an hour later, her hair disheveled and a guilty look in her eyes. Mark's suspicions were no longer just suspicions, they were confirmed facts. And as he pieced together the truth, his heartbreak began to morph into something much darker, a cold, calculating desire for revenge. Mark's patience was rewarded sooner than he had expected. One afternoon, he returned home earlier than usual, his mind still buzzing with the thoughts of Sarah's betrayal. As he walked up the driveway, he noticed that the house was unusually quiet. The sounds of construction that had filled the air for weeks were absent, and the front door was slightly ajar. Mark's heart began to race as he quietly entered the house, every instinct telling him that something was wrong. He made his way through the hallway, the silence of the house amplifying his growing sense of dread. As he approached the stairs, he heard it, muffled voices coming from the master bedroom, followed by a low, breathless laugh that he recognized all too well. Without thinking, Mark climbed the stairs, his footsteps silent on the carpeted steps. As he reached the top, the voices became clearer, and with each word, his fury grew. He pushed open the door to the bedroom, and there in the bed they had shared for years was Sarah with Jack and Ryan. The scene before him was like something out of a nightmare. Sarah, caught in the throes of passion with the two builders, didn't notice Mark at first, but when she did, her face went pale with shock. Jack and Ryan scrambled to cover themselves, their faces a mixture of surprise and fear. Mark stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes locked on Sarah's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the heavy breathing of the three people in the room. Mark's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts crashing into each other, but all he could feel was a deep, burning rage. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Mark, I can explain," she stammered, but Mark cut her off with a cold, hard look. "Don't," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't say another word," without another glance at his wife or her lovers. Mark turned and walked out of the room. As he descended the stairs, his mind was already formulating a plan. He had always been a man of precision and control, and now he would use those qualities to exact his revenge. Mark's anger simmered just below the surface, cold and calculating. He spent the following days in a state of eerie calm, going through the motions of daily life as if nothing had happened. He continued to be polite and attentive to Sarah, never once hinting at the storm brewing inside him, to Sarah. It seemed as if Mark had forgiven her, or perhaps had not fully grasped the extent of her betrayal. But Mark was far from forgiving. Instead, he was planning his revenge with meticulous detail. He began by reaching out to a private investigator, a man he had worked with before on cases involving construction fraud. The investigator was discreet and thorough, exactly what Mark needed. He hired him to dig deeper into Sarah's affair, to find out every detail about her secret tryst with Jack and Ryan. Within days, the investigator delivered a file filled with evidence, photos, text messages, even video recordings. Mark pored over the documents late into the night, each piece of evidence fueling his resolve. He learned that the affair had been going on for months and that Sarah had even considered leaving him for one of the builders. The betrayal cut deep, but it also solidified his determination to make her pay. Mark's plan was simple but effective. He began by cutting off Sarah's access to their joint bank accounts, leaving her with only a small personal account she used for household expenses. He wanted to create a sense of insecurity to make her realize just how dependent she was on him. Next, he arranged for a series of accidents to occur at the house, small things that would gradually escalate in severity. The first incident was a simple slip on the newly polished floor, causing Sarah to sprain her ankle. Mark feigned concern, but inwardly he felt a grim satisfaction. The second accident was more serious. Sarah's car brakes mysteriously failed as she was driving home from the grocery store, causing her to swerve off the road and crash into a ditch. She emerged shaken but unscathed, and Mark was there to comfort her, his expression carefully neutral. But Sarah was beginning to suspect that something was wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was behind the strange incidents, but she had no proof. The thought of confronting him terrified her, so she remained silent, hoping that the accidents were just the string of bad luck. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah's life began to unravel. The once confident, vibrant woman was now a shadow of her former self, constantly looking over her shoulder, jumping at every unexpected sound. Mark's calculated cruelty was taking its toll, and she found herself retreating further into isolation. The affair with Jack and Ryan had lost its thrill, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread that she couldn't shake. Jack and Ryan, sensing the change in Sarah, began to distance themselves from her. They had no interest in getting caught up in whatever was going on between her and Mark. They continued with their work, but their interactions with Sarah became more professional. The flirtation that had once defined their relationship now a distant memory. Mark watched all of this with a cold detachment. He had achieved exactly what he wanted. Sarah was broken, isolated, and completely under his control. But the satisfaction he had expected to feel never came. Instead, he was consumed by a growing sense of emptiness, a hollow void where his love for Sarah had once been. One evening, as Mark sat alone in his study, he found himself going through the file the investigator had given him once more. He stared at the photos of Sarah with Jack and Ryan, their faces blurred by the motion of their secret rendezvous. A part of him had hoped that he would find some solace in revenge, that it would somehow make up for the betrayal. But all it had done was deepen his misery. It was then that Mark realized that his plan had one final step, one that would bring everything to a close once and for all. The day of reckoning came sooner than Sarah expected. It was a rainy Thursday evening, the sky a deep shade of gray, reflecting the bleak she felt inside. Mark had been unusually quiet that day, his mood unreadable. She had spent most of the afternoon in the bedroom, trying to avoid him, the weight of her guilt and fear pressing down on her like a physical burden. When Mark called her downstairs for dinner, his voice was calm, almost soothing. Sarah hesitated for a moment before obeying, a sense of foreboding settling in the pit of her stomach. As she entered the dining room, she noticed that the table was set with her finest china, candles flickering softly in the dim light. It was a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. Mark greeted her with a smile, his eyes betraying nothing. "I thought we could have a nice dinner tonight," he said, pulling out a chair for her. Sarah nodded mutely, her heart pounding in her chest as she sat down. The meal was a quiet one, with Mark making small talk about work and the renovations, while Sarah answered in monosyllables, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, that this was the calm before the storm. As they finished their meal, Mark stood up and walked over to the cabinet, pulling out a bottle of wine. He poured them each a glass, handing one to Sarah before raising his own in a toast. To us, he said, his voice steady. To 10 years of marriage. Sarah forced a smile, clinking her glass against his, but the wine turned sour in her mouth. She could barely swallow, her throat constricting. As she watched Mark take a sip from his glass, he set the glass down and looked at her, his expression unreadable. Sarah, he began, his voice soft. I know about the affair. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sarah's heart stopped, her mind going blank as she tried to process what he had just said. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Mark continued, his tone calm and measured. I've known for a while now. I've seen the texts, the photos. I even know about the meetings in our bedroom. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she realized the full extent of what he knew. Mark, I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for it to happen. But Mark cut her off with a wave of his hand. It doesn't matter now, he said, his voice growing colder. What's done is done, but there's one more thing I need to tell you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial, placing it on the table between them. Do you know what this is? Sarah stared at the vial, her breath catching in her throat. What is that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark smiled, a cruel twist of his lips. It's a poison, tasteless, odorless, and very effective. It's already in your wine. Sarah's eyes widened in horror as she looked down at her glass, the reality of his words hitting her like a freight train. No, Mark, please. But Mark just stood there, watching her with a cold detachment. You brought this on yourself, Sarah. You made your choices, and now you have to face the consequences. As the poison began to take effect, Sarah felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. Her vision blurred and the room seemed to spin around her. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her, sending her crashing to the floor. Mark watched with a detached calm as Sarah struggled to breathe, her body convulsing as the poison did its work. He felt no pity, no remorse, only a deep, hollow emptiness. This was the culmination of everything, the final act in the tragedy that their marriage had become. Sarah's struggles grew weaker, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she clawed at the floor, trying to reach for something, anything that could save her. But there was nothing. The poison was too strong, too quick. Within minutes, her body went still, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Mark stood over her, his face expressionless. The woman he had once loved, the woman who had betrayed him, was gone. But instead of the satisfaction he had expected to feel, there was only a profound sense of loss. He knew he couldn't stay there. He had to leave, to disappear before anyone discovered what he had done. But as he turned to walk away, he was met with an unexpected sight. Jack and Ryan standing in the doorway, their faces pale with shock on it. Jack and Ryan had returned to the house to collect their tools, unaware of the horrors unfolding inside. They had seen Mark's car in the driveway and assumed he had left the door unlocked, but as they entered the house, they were met with a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Sarah lay motionless on the floor, her once vibrant eyes now dull and lifeless, and standing over her with a look of cold indifference was Mark. For a moment, the three men just stared at each other, the weight of the situation sinking in. Mark was the first to speak, his voice low and threatening. You weren't supposed to see this. What I had to do. She betrayed me, and now it's over. Jack took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. You killed her. You murdered your own wife. Mark's eyes narrowed, his calm facade slipping just a fraction. You don't understand. She was cheating on me with both of you. The accusation hung in the air, and Jack felt his stomach drop. He knew they had crossed the line with Sarah, but he had never expected it to come to this. We didn't mean for it to go this far, Jack said, his voice filled with regret. We never wanted her to get hurt. Mark laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Hurt. You think this is about her getting hurt? This is about betrayal, about trust being shattered. And now you two have a choice. Ryan frowned. What choice? Mark's expression hardened. You can either walk away from this, forget everything you've seen and never come back, or you can try to stop me, and I'll make sure you end up just like her." Jack and Ryan looked at each other, weighing their options. They knew they were in deep and that any wrong move could cost them their lives. But they also knew they couldn't just walk away from what they had seen. Sarah might have been unfaithful, but she didn't deserve to die like this. Ryan was the first to move. With a sudden burst of speed, he lunged at Mark, aiming to disarm him. But Mark was ready. He sidestepped the attack and brought his fist down on Ryan's back, sending him crashing to the floor. Jack sprang into action, grabbing a nearby chair and swinging it at Mark. The blow caught him on the shoulder, knocking him off balance. Mark stumbled but quickly recovered, his eyes blazing with fury. The fight was brutal, the three men grappling and striking at each other with everything they had. Furniture was overturned, glass shattered, and the sound of their struggle echoed through the house. Despite their combined strength, Jack and Ryan were no match for Mark's cold determination. He fought with a ruthless precision, using every object within reach as a weapon. Jack was the first to fall, a sharp blow to the head, rendering him unconscious. Ryan, bleeding and battered, knew he couldn't keep this up much longer, but he refused to give up. He charged at Mark again, this time managing to land a solid punch to his jaw. Mark staggered back, momentarily dazed. Seeing his chance, Ryan grabbed a heavy candlestick and brought it down on Mark's head with all his strength. Mark crumpled to the floor, blood pooling around his head. Ryan stood over him, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at Jack, who was still unconscious, then at Sarah's lifeless body. The house was a scene of carnage, and Ryan knew they had to get out of there. Ryan's mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. Couldn't stay in the house. He had to leave to get as far away as possible before anyone discovered what had happened. But he couldn't just abandon Jack, and he couldn't leave Sarah's body there for the authorities to find. He dragged Jack's unconscious form to the car, laying him in the back seat before returning to the house. He looked at Sarah one last time, a wave of guilt washing over him. He had never intended for any of this to happen, but now he was in too deep. With shaking hands, Ryan cleaned up the scene as best he could, wiping down surfaces and removing any traces of their presence. He knew it wouldn't be enough to a thorough investigation, but it was all he could do in the short time he had. Finally, he returned to the car and drove away, his heart pounding in his chest. As he sped down the dark, empty streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that at any moment Mark would rise from the dead and come after him. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, all he saw was his own haunted reflection staring back at him. Weeks passed, and Ryan lived in constant fear of being caught. He and Jack had gone into hiding, moving from one motel to another, always looking over their shoulders. The guilt and paranoia were slowly eating away at him, and he knew he couldn't keep running forever. One night, as he lay in a dingy motel room, Ryan's phone rang. The caller ID was blocked, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello?" he said, his voice shaky. There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a familiar voice. "Ryan? Did you really think you could get away with it?" Ryan's blood ran cold. It was Mark's voice, low and menacing and filled with a quiet rage. "But you're dead," Ryan stammered, his heart pounding in his chest. "I killed you," Mark chuckled, a chilling sound that sent shivers down Ryan's spine. "You thought you did, but I'm very much alive, and now it's your turn to pay." Before Ryan could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, his mind racing. Had Mark somehow survived? Was he coming for them? The thought was terrifying, but there was no time to think. He had to warn Jack. But when Ryan turned to wake Jack, he found him already awake, staring at the door with wide, terrified eyes. "He's here," Jack whispered, his voice trembling. "Mark is here." Ryan's blood turned to ice as he heard the door knob rattle, followed by a soft, menacing laugh from the other side. The door creaked open, and there, standing in the shadows, was Mark, his face twisted into a murderous grin. "Time to finish what we started," Mark said, stepping into the room, a gleaming knife in his hand. The final chapter in this twisted tale had begun, and there was no escape. The police found the bodies the next morning. The motel room was a scene of pure horror. Blood splattered across the walls, the floor littered with broken furniture, and the lifeless bodies of Jack and Ryan. The officers who arrived on the scene had seen their share of gruesome crime scenes, but this one was different. There was something deeply unsettling about it, something that went beyond the physical carnage. There were no indications of forced entry, no evidence to point investigators in the right direction. The only tangible clue was a single, smeared, bloody handprint found on the front door, too distorted to yield any clear identification. With no additional leads, no suspects, and no definitive answers, the investigation quickly hit a dead end. The case turned cold, leaving behind an eerie silence where answers should have been. Mark Thompson vanished without a trace, never to be seen again. Rumors swirled like wildfire. Some speculated that he had managed to escape the country, leaving his life and crimes behind. Others believed he had fallen victim to his own violent schemes, meeting a grim and possibly karmic demise. Despite all the theories, the truth remained elusive, hidden in the shadows along with the secrets of those whose lives were claimed in his act of cold and calculated vengeance. Sarah's betrayal had set off a catastrophic chain reaction, one that spiraled far beyond anyone's control. What began as a moment of passion and infidelity ultimately led to a series of devastating events that left nothing but heartbreak and destruction in their wake. In the end, every individual entangled in the tragedy suffered deeply, paying the ultimate price for the choices they had made. What remained were broken lives, shattered relationships, and a host of lingering, unanswered questions. The once beautiful house, which had been filled with laughter, love, and vibrant energy, was now a hollow shell of its former self. Its grand halls stood empty, its silence oppressive and haunting. It served as a chilling reminder of the darkness that had consumed everyone who had lived there, a monument to the pain and despair that had unfolded within its walls. What do you think really happened? Share your theories and thoughts in the comment section below. Don't forget to take care of yourselves, and we'll catch you in the next video.